So, how does the notion of social construction regarding gender, as well as how it becomes real via gender performativity, for example, how does that apply to ethnic studies? And here we're going to focus mostly on Asian American gendered stereotypes. Now, this material already introduced as far back as when we talked about the Chinese being recruited by the railroad companies and felt they weren't manly enough at first due to certain stereotypes. So this brings us back to good old Orientalism. That's the ideology again that the separation of the world into two areas, and the corollary to that is that people within the Oriental world are fundamentally different from people in the Occidental world. And in fact, it's hard to transplant someone from the Oriental world to the Occidental world, right? The idea or the notion of assimilation was not conceivable according to Orientalism. And let's remember, we just looked at General DeWitt, if you recall Japanese internment. General DeWitt in 1942 felt that the Japanese simply could not be trusted because they are perpetual foreigners. And why are they perpetual foreigners? Because of Orientalism. Okay, so needless to say, Orientalism will spill over to gendered stereotypes. Okay, and this slide before you lists some of those stereotypes. Asian men, again, seen as lacking in masculinity, seen as docile, passive, nerdy, unlike the Western male who's, assertive and very masculine, right? Asian men, on the other hand, according to Orientalist stereotypes, are physically weak, even asexual, right? Almost female-like, unassertive, nerdy, inferior to other men of other races in almost every way, right? Especially the Western male. Now, when we look at Asian women and how they're stereotyped in the past, and some of these still persist today. They're seen as dutiful and obedient, hence the notion of, the Asian bride as the perfect partner for someone, right? They're dutiful and obedient. They won't question you. They won't question patriarchy, so to say, right? According to the stereotype. That element of exoticism, right? They're exotic looking, sexually accessible, always subservient to the man. This is still around today. And some of it is actually stereotypes, that is almost the opposite of, dutiful. It's this idea of them being hypersexualized as prostitutes. This goes all the way back to the Chinese when Americans used to view the Chinese women as all prostitutes, and hence the passage of the Page Act, if you recall. Okay, so this would persist over to the 20th century. We'll see it in our cultural production, like, for example, this black and white illustration here is a famous trope or image of Asian women that was predominant back then. It was called the Susie Wong trope, okay, where she was seen as a prostitute and hypersexualized. And by the way, the Atlanta shootings brought to the fore the notion of Asian women fulfilling the stereotype for some men, right, as hypersexualized prostitutes. Hence the killer's fantasies of killing them, right, because they supposedly made him have impure thoughts, right? Okay, so this stereotype kind of reared its ugly head again during that discussion a year or two ago. Okay, so you can see this persist, actually, as I mentioned. In fact, here's a show where, they still use the idea of a nerdy Asian male. Here is some of the stereotypes again, that are associated with Asian men. And then here's that whole Asian fetish, so to speak, Asian women fetish that some men supposedly have, right? and so on and so forth. So they still persist today. And in fact, in Hollywood today, a lot of Asian American actors, now there's a paucity of Asian Americans in the Hollywood film industry. Okay, there's not a lot. And what they protest against, what they lament, is the fact that they seem to get called to interviews only for that role where they have to play that stereotypical foreigner, or perhaps hypersexualized for women, or the men being nerdy and docile and, math loving stereotype, right? Well, you know, in the past, if you look at our films, for example, during the 40s, 50s, 60s, it's replete with these images of Asian men and women fulfilling those stereotypes. If you've ever seen, and these are some more famous ones, right? If you've ever seen the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, which I believe came out in, I want to say the 1960s, with Audrey Hepburn. There's a character there, a Japanese landlord who's played by a white actor, Mickey Rooney, but I mean, the stereotyping is really thick there, right? It's really, thick Asian accent, buck teeth, slanted eyes. He made him the makeup on him and everything, wearing a robe and everything, right? So, in fact, Mickey Rooney, the actor, definitely regretted that he played that role later on. He confessed in his life. Others include, Mr. Miyagi and Karate Kid. The whole thing is, why can't they just be Americans? Why do they have to be always the stereotype foreigner, right? That goes back to perpetual foreigner, right? Orientalism. Right? That's the way Asians were perceived, especially back then. Now, this is less so today because, we are, not only because of increased immigration, like we discussed, right, post 65. And hence, especially in Southern California, or California in general, you see more Asians than, say, Arkansas or Kentucky, right? But that stereotype of Asians being foreigners is just starting to dissipate, okay? And you'll see Hollywood, in fact, have or TV roles or movie roles where the actor who is of Asian descent is playing American with no accent, right? Just a typical American. And this is something new, generally speaking, in our cultural industry. Okay, so that's the notion of Orientalism and how it spills over into gender, right, of Asian Americans. Now, I had you read Paul Nadal, which I sent as a PDF for you. So I want you guys to work on these questions, okay, regarding sexuality now, sexual orientation, homosexuality, and how that is negotiated in racial or ethnic terms. Okay, basically, Nadal talks about how, let's say, sexual orientation or homosexuality is conceived or conceptualized, thought of differently in the Philippines compared to the United States. And he talks about a myriad of reasons for this, Roman Catholicism, where it's repressed. So it's kind of, swept under the carpet, right? Sexual orientation. In fact, the name of the article is Tomboys and Bakla, and both of those terms, okay, in the Philippines, tomboy is English, right? And Bakla is native language. But they both emphasize gendered behavior and not sexual orientation. In the Philippines, they find a way to separate the two when they talk about the LGBTQ community, the members of those community. Okay, so what happens when you take that, let's say an immigrant, a gay immigrant coming to the United States, and then, how is that complicated when they try to integrate themselves within the LGBTQ community here, right? And this is what he talks about, how it's so, both sides are in flux, and therefore it leads to problems of identity, right? And conceiving of their own identity as members of the LGBTQ community, okay? So Again, read that article, and these are certainly going to be questions in your final exam study questions. Okay, and that wraps up our lecture material for gender and sexuality.